In this video, I'm going to show you guys how I install a 3-prong power cord in an old vintage amp. The test subject will be a 1966 Fender Pro Reverb, and I will walk you guys through step by step how I do it. So let's take it apart and throw it on the workbench. So here the amp is on the workbench. It looks beautiful, nearly all original, super clean, kind of exactly what you want to see. So I'm going to go through the steps before you do anything in the amp to make sure it's completely safe. So step 1, make sure it's not plugged into the wall. So whenever you have the chassis open like this, make sure it's unplugged always. So that's step 1. Step 2, you're going to grab your multimeter and put it over into DC volts. Now I'm going to include in the description of this video a link to all of the items I'm using so that you guys can kind of see if you want to purchase it for yourself, including this multimeter as well as these nifty little grabbing probes here. So again, you're going to put in DC voltage, and then you're going to go ahead and connect this side to ground. I like where the little holes are for the screws in the chassis to put that there, and it just kind of hooks in. Again, be careful not to touch anything in there, but there's plenty of room to just kind of lock it in there, and then it's not going to move on you. So next, you want to go ahead and put this on a space on the board where there should be voltage if there is any. And right here, this red and black wire, those are connected to the output transformer, and that is a good place because there's a little jumper wire on these Fenders to where you can easily grab the probe onto it and see high voltage. And would you look at that, we have 343 volts going down slowly but surely, and that's going down mainly because the multimeter is connected to it, and so it's slowly draining it. But obviously 335 volts is quite a lot. So this is kind of where the danger comes into play and why people are always warning you not to jump in an amp if you don't know what you're doing. It's because it's a lot of voltage, but it's very easy to render safe if you know what you're doing. So now that we have that probe there, we're gonna go ahead and grab one of these. This is called a snuffer stick. Again, I will put a link to this in the description. You can make one of these yourself, but you can also just purchase one like I did here. And you're gonna take this end, connect it to ground, which just means the chassis, and then you're gonna go ahead and push this right up against where there is high voltage. Where I have it now is one spot. You could also do it right back here. There's a number of areas, but on a Fender like this, it's really easy to just kind of lightly press against that jumper wire, and you can see it's going down. So one really critical factor here, if you're planning to do any work in the amp, especially in the doghouse, which are the area with the main electrolytic capacitors on the other side of the chassis, is make sure that the standby switch is off. So right now it's on. So we are draining all of the voltage that's in the chassis here, but it's not actually draining the caps in the doghouse. So what I like to do is just always make sure that standby is off. And you'll see it change the voltage there, but now we are actually draining all of the caps. So that's really important. You don't need to have the amp on with on switch, but you do need to have standby off. So now we're 6 volts, so under a 9-volt battery. So really no concern here. We'll just do it a little bit further just to be safe. Okay, so now we're in 5-volt territory, so really nothing to worry about. So go ahead and disconnect this. And then just to be extra safe, we can go ahead and check a different node, make sure it's the same. It is all about 5 volts. Great. So we're pretty good, feel pretty confident about that, feel very confident about that the amp is now safe. Now, when you are working inside of an amp, there's one trick that somebody taught me, which was to always have one hand kind of in your pocket. So if you're ever poking and prodding around inside of the amp, you don't want to have one hand, holding the chassis and then poking and prodding, because if you do that, and there is a voltage, it will go kind of through your body to your hand to ground here, and that's where you can have the real issues, especially with the voltage going across your heart. So don't want to do that, but now the amp is completely safe. Hand in a pocket, I can poke around, and we've rendered it safe. So we're good to go to move on to the next step. Now, I do definitely recommend buying some kind of little non-conductive stick. This is something I have. To be honest, I'm not even sure where I got this, but just a piece of plastic, and then that way you can kind of poke and prod inside the amp. But that's more for another video. But for this video, we can go ahead and shift the amp over and take a look at this 2-prong power cord. So we've now got the 2-prong power cord in sight here. You can see one end is connected to this courtesy outlet, and then the other end is connected to the other side of the courtesy outlet. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and just desolder these two leads so that we can then pull it through. I would highly recommend having some kind of grabber like this that does not have teeth on it. You can find these all over different stores, but that way you're not mangling wires. Now, these don't really matter because obviously we're just throwing this away, but if you're trying to, touch something a bit more fragile and important, such as maybe these wires here with the output transformer, you're going to want something like that. So my one little tip there. So with soldering, I've got it turned up to just about as hot as my soldering iron will go. I will also put a link to that in the description. You're going to always want to make sure you're adding some solder to tin it, and then I am using Caster solder, which does have lead in it, which just works significantly better than the other type of solder. So we're going to grab it on one end and just kind of touch, and it pulls out very easily. If your soldering iron is nice and hot and you've got good solder, it should take no time at all to pull something like this out. Now this one does look like it's in at a little bit of a weird angle, so we'll see how well this pulls out. There we go. Okay, so now we can go ahead and adjust the chassis to pull the strain relief out. Now these suck. These are really hard to get out. I guess there's a tool you can buy that makes it easier, but I'm going to show you kind of my semi-janky method to pull those out. So this is what we want to remove. This top part you kind of squish in, and then that enables you to pull the cable out. However, when you're pushing this in, it is also squeezing the cable, which gives resistance, which just makes it very difficult. So like I said, there is a tool I guess you can use for this, but kind of one thing I've learned is if you add just a little bit of some thick electrical tape, you can kind of serve as a nice little buffer for the chassis to make sure you don't scratch up the chassis when you're trying to pull it out with regular pliers. So I'm going to go ahead and apply some of that around the top and bottom. And then you can get some different kind of pliers, channel locks, or something like this. And again, you're just going to want to squeeze this part down and pull it out. So just like that, 2-prong power cord that came with the amp. We will go ahead and set that aside and grab the new one. So here we've got the new 3-prong cable. You can see I left plenty of lead length for these so that I have lots of flexibility on where I want the chassis ground to go. And then we have the new strain relief. So we're basically just going to go ahead and feed this through the hole. Now the hole is not a perfect circle. It's got flat sides on either side here, which means the strain relief really goes in one of two ways. You always want the tab facing up. So go ahead and feed this through. Have this outer shell just kind of go maybe an inch or so in, and then we'll clamp this like this. Now this is where it gets a bit finicky, but hopefully we can get this done on camera relatively smooth. So you want to just kind of hold it, place it, get a nice clamp on it. And then see if you can feed that in. There we go. Perfect. So now that's in there. Once again, we can remove the electrical tape. Put this off to the side. And now let's go ahead and adjust the chassis once again so you guys can see and I can also see what we're doing next. All right, so now we can go ahead and start figuring out the placement of the wires and where they're going to go. So green is obviously the ground. That's going to be to the chassis roughly right there. We'll loop that like that to keep a long lead length because you want that to be typically the longest of the three. The white is the neutral. We're going to connect it here to the receptacle and disconnect the other end, and we'll connect one of the black leads from the power transformer here as well. And then the black is the hot, And I move these out of the way. These are the stock wires. They're tucked under this lip normally, but I'd move them out of the way just so we can kind of see where they're connected. And basically what we're going to do is this black lead will go here to the tip of the fuse, and then this lead right here is the one that will go there from the power transformer, and this yellow lead will go from here on the ground switch over to this part of the fuse, and so that will connect the hot through the fuse to the switch, which is connected to the power transformer. Now let's go ahead and desolder this and this and this off of the fuse, and also these here to kind of set ourselves up for success here. Now, one important thing is obviously you want to remove the fuse whenever you're soldering the fuse area here. So I want to make sure that's taken out of the way. Now, as always, add a little bit of solder. And then we're just going to go ahead and start removing. So we've got a bit of a spaghetti mess here, but we will clean that up in no time. I just want to make sure everything is out of the way so that we have plenty of room to solder. So now we're going to go ahead and move this transformer lead and snake it back around to this side. So we're going to go ahead and add a little bit of a kink to this just to give it a little bit more of a mechanical connection. Also just to help us hold it there in place a bit more. All right, so that's on there pretty good. Now we're gonna go ahead and strip the neutral and cut it down to size. We can have this be fairly short. Just about there should be fine. Go ahead and twist that. And then we're gonna tin it, which basically means just adding solder. Makes everything flow better. Go ahead and feed it through there. Actually, I made it a little bit long, so we can go ahead and cut that down just a hair. And I will add a little bit of a bend to this one as well, for the same reason. Okay, so now we can go ahead and add some solder. So the neutral is connected to the power transformer. So that's good to go now. Now we can go ahead and connect this lead right here to the fuse. There we go. So all of the old solder removed. Now we can actually make more of a mechanical connection, which will obviously be preferable. Don't need it to be a complete, closed hook or anything like that, but just a little bend just to add a little bit more of a mechanical connection is typically preferable. Sweet. So go ahead and tuck this one out of the way now. All right, now we're going to go ahead and remove solder from the fuse tip. Perfect. So now that is going to be where the hot connection goes. Run this under the neutral. Go ahead and remove some wire. Shorten the lead length a little bit. All right, so just like before, I'm gonna tin it just a little bit. Perfect. Now we're gonna run this up and under. All right, so now let's go ahead and add some solder. That's all done. We got these extra leads here. So let's just go ahead and kind of tuck these out of the way. I'm going to disconnect this other end on the courtesy outlet. It's not being used. So now we don't really want just kind of leads flying everywhere that aren't connected to anything, so we don't want any shorts to happen. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just connect them to the other ends of the ground plug here, or the ground switch, just to kind of have it be completely out of the way and not doing anything. All right. So the ground switch is completely out of circuit. Everything is just, every end is just soldered to itself. So there's nothing connected to this. And then we still have the lead here, which goes to the switch, and the other end is the power. Neutral here, other end of the power transformer is there. So that's all of this done and to code. So the last piece of the puzzle is, of course, the ground connection. Now this is where things get a bit more tricky. And so I'm going to try and show you guys what I do, and hopefully that will be helpful. And always open to new tips as well for me. So let's go ahead and reposition a little bit and get geared up to do the ground chassis connection. So here's where things get much, much more advanced and difficult, and you do need special tools for this side. So I personally purchased this Hakko model 551 150 watt soldering iron to do chassis grounds with. It is beefy, it is heavy, it gets very hot fairly quickly, and is more than adequate for a chassis ground, if not overkill. A lot of people use really old soldering irons. Personally, I couldn't find any. There were none available on my local Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace when I looked, and this was the only thing I could find online at the time. Now, I believe there are better options out there from Weber that I didn't know about, but I'm not really sure. I can't speak to those firsthand. Good thing about this is, like I said, it gets hot very quickly. It's more than hot enough. The bad thing, the tip it comes with is very pointy, kind of like the tip of a spear, and it makes it very difficult because you have to get it very kind of weird angles to be able to actually get a decent surface area on the chassis heated up. So I put on a different tip here. I believe this was a Weller tip that I found that measured the same. Another thing that's a bit tough about this is the balance. It is extremely heavy on this side, and the handle over here, it just kind of, all the weight is on your fingertips when you're trying to do things, and you can see how long it is. So you really got this kind of weird fulcrum point that just makes it a bit more difficult than it needs to be. So I would not recommend purchasing this, but if you guys have any recommendations for everyone on what to buy, please drop them in the comments. Either way, this is what I have. So we're gonna go ahead and turn this on and let it heat up. And while it's heating up, we can go ahead and clean this part of the chassis that we're going to be putting this. So like I showed in the mock-up, we will just be curving that right there. And then the placement will be roughly kind of here-ish. So we're going to go ahead, actually let's go ahead and strip this first, and then we will clean that. Perfect. So now that's done, let's go ahead and clean this area. Now there's a few different ways you can do this. You can use naphtha, you can use isopropyl. Either should work. I think we'll do isopropyl and grab a cloth and just kind of start cleaning this area. So let me do that real quick. quite dirty right there. But isopropyl makes pretty short work of it. Let's hit it one more time. It's really important that this is a very clean connection to ground. So now the next step is we got to figure out the placement, and then we want to go ahead and score the chassis, scratch it up, sand it so that there's more grab for the solder to connect. So we'll kind of estimate we'll be right about there, more or less. All right, so one thing we do have to be mindful of is the size of the soldering iron and kind of squeezing in here without burning this wire right here. So perfect, that looks really good. So that's going to be the placement of it. So now I'm going to slide this just out of the way a little bit and go ahead and score that area. Now there's a few different ways you can do this. You can use a dental toothpick, which I will use, and then you can also use a flathead screwdriver, something like this, and just kind of put some hash marks in it. So let's go and do that. Now you do want to go pretty hard and try and actually put some marks in the chassis. You want to be able to feel it because you want the solder to grab onto something. All right, that looks pretty good. Now we're going to go ahead and clean it one more time just to get all the little metal particles out. Perfect. I rub my fingernail over it to make sure I can feel that. There's texture, which is exactly what we want. So now let's reposition this. That's going to go like that. Awesome. So we can kind of move it out of the way and go ahead and check our soldering iron and get some solder on the chassis first as a starting point. Okay. So that looks really good. Now is the hard part. So we want to try and get this lead in the right area to be able to push it down. Now what I should have done is tinned this as well. It's not really going to matter because that soldering iron is so hot, it's not going to have any issue connecting, but regardless, best practice, I should have tinned that, but I already turned off the soldering iron, so we will move forward. Now what you can do is get some helping hands to assist here, which I might end up doing, but let's just see if we can get it without that first. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now what I am going to do is I'm going to try and get it on there, and then I'm going to possibly, if I need to, push this down with the dental toothpick just to make sure that it holds and doesn't lift up. Now naturally, because I've bent the wire, its natural state it wants to be in is actually pushing down. So this is kind of more an extra piece. Sometimes you need to do it more than other times, but now we can go ahead and do this part. We're going to, of course, retin the soldering iron. Just like that. Should be good to go. I'm just going to look at it, inspect it. Probably going to do it one more time just to be totally 100% sure, but it does look solid. Add a little bit more solder. And I'm just going to hold the wire down on this end and then hit it once more. Perfect. Decided I'm going to hit it one more time just from this end. I just want, because the angle is so sharp, it's kind of hard to get it from that side. So I'm just going to push down on this side and give it a little bit extra. There we go. Beautiful. That looks really, really good. Visually, it looks perfect. Nice and flat. We do have a little bit of a squish on the plastic covering, but that does not matter one bit. Yeah, that doesn't mean anything. So awesome. Now let's go ahead and grab our multimeter to do a continuity test. So on my multimeter, it's got this little sound icon for the continuity test. It will vary based off of your own personal multimeter you're using, but we're going to go ahead and connect one end. This will be, we're going to check the chassis ground connection for the ground on here. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. That should be this one. Perfect. So we do have a good connection there. Next up, we want to go ahead and check the neutral. There we go. So that works. And then we will check the hot connection. Perfect. So those are all as they should be. So it's wired up correctly. Beautiful. There we go. As you can see, I put the fuse back in here. Now let's just once again quadruple confirm everything, and I will grab the camera and show you guys a close-up so you can get a better view of everything that was done. So let's do that now. Okay, so here we have the Pro Reverb. We'll start with the ground connection. Nice and shiny. Solid chassis ground for sure. White is the neutral. We used the courtesy outlet there as an easy way to join the power transformer black lead to the neutral. The other end was disconnected. As mentioned, you can maintain the courtesy outlet if you would like to. However, I feel it's kind of pointless because it's a two-prong, so I opted not to. Then all of these wires right here on the ground switch are just looping over on themselves from one end to the other end. So they're not connected to anything, but all the original cables are still there. Then the fuse, you have the fuse tip, which is the hot end of the lead here off of the three-prong. And then the other end on the fuse here wraps over to the power switch, which is that yellow wire on the left-hand side. And then the black wire is the other lead off of the power transformer. So that's it. As simple as that. So the last thing we're going to do is check our work. So we've got the three-prong cable now plugged into our current limiter here. And this is a 200-watt incandescent bulb. If you want to know about how to build one of these, I will link a video, an excellent video that I followed the directions from, so you can do that yourself. And then I've got the current limiter plugged into a variac over here, so I can bring up the voltage slowly. And then I have my multimeter connected chassis ground, the one I showed you originally, and then we're connected to the tip of the fuse, which is the hot lead off of the three-prong, so we can make sure that we're getting the same voltage. Now, it will be a little bit different than what's on the variac because of the current limiter, but regardless, we should be more or less good to go, or it'll be very clear if something's wrong. So we'll go ahead and turn the amp on. We've got it in standby. Now, obviously, nothing will come on because there's no voltage. So we'll go ahead and bring up that voltage. Continue to slowly bring that up. Now we're at 91 volts or so. The light bulb is not lit up, which is good. If it lights up, that means something is wrong. And we are getting 91 volts right here to the tip of the fuse. So just to check real quick, we will pull this off and then we will connect it to this part of the switch right here, which should be getting the same, and it is. So that tells us things are looking good. We'll continue to bring this up to 120. 119 it's showing. Light bulb, nothing is showing. So there you go. You even got the pilot light on. So this amp is good to go and now rendered safe. All right, guys, that does it. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more, subscribe. Until next time, I'll see you.